Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Food, the other big climate lever. My name is Tenille Bonoguore, and I work at the Arrell Food Institute, which is housed just up the road at the University of Guelph. For those in the audience tonight, first of all, thank you for braving the elements. We are very glad to have you with us. Some practicalities. The emergency exits are at the back of the hall, should we need them, and to find the washrooms, you just go out this side door and head towards the rear of the building. Please come and go as you need. We're here tonight in Waterloo, Ontario, which sits on the traditional territories of the Tnonatin, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and it forms part of the Holderman Tract. Guelph, where AFI is located, sits on the traditional territories of the Attawandaronk, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and it forms part of the Between the Lakes Purchase. For hundreds of years, these nations shared these lands under the dish with one spoon wampum. That wampum embodies three agreements, three promises to each other and to the land. Take only what you need, always leave something for others, and keep the dish, the land, clean. In just over 7 generations, that covenant has shifted from being a lived reality to now being a hope of something that we might one day see again. On behalf of AFI, I offer our deep respect and gratitude to all traditional owners of these lands and to Indigenous peoples around the world for your continuing stewardship, leadership, wisdom, and strength. Now, we're here tonight to talk about food and climate. For many people, the connection between those two things seems obvious, but too often society's responses, their plans, the policies, the actions, they splinter into a fractured landscape. Food people and climate people can find themselves working in completely different spheres. And that's a problem because the three biggest challenges that we face today, climate change, biodiversity loss, and inequality, they are intimately connected to food. But that connection is also an opportunity because food can and should form part of the solution to those big challenges. At the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph, we bring together people, ideas, and research to spark good change, to create a more sustainable, nutritious, and equitable food system that works for people and planet. And tonight, we are going to hear from a great range of people, from farmers and researchers to funders and founders and more. In the room and online, we have brought together food people, climate people, tech people, business people, community people, all people interested in making positive change. So welcome. We are very glad you're here, and we look forward to finding out what we can achieve together. Now, I'd like to invite our first panelists to come and join me on stage as I introduce the first discussion. Thank you. Now, agriculture and food generates almost a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. The sector is a leading cause of global deforestation and biodiversity loss. Even if we got rid of fossil fuels tomorrow, an unchanged food system would still push the planet past 2 degrees of warming. What we eat, where we grow it, how we package it and process it and transport it. These things are affected by and directly impact climate change. So, how can food systems be a driver of climate action? And why do we need stronger links between the two? To talk about this tonight, we have Margaret, a policy analyst at Agriculture and Agri-food Canada. Dialing in from her farm in Chesley, Ontario, due to the terrible weather, we're glad you can still join us, is Brenda Hsueh. She is the owner of Black Sheep Farm and is a program coordinator for Farmers for Climate Solutions. Hi, Brenda. And we've got Ibrahim Mohammed, who is the Sustainability and Environment Specialist at Grain Farmers of Ontario. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Brenda, for pivoting to online. We very much appreciate it. So to get us started, Margaret, you work for the federal government and you focus on food systems and food system transformation at the global level. So to get us started, can you tell us a bit about what the science is telling us about food systems around the world and here in Canada?
Sure. So I think just from your introduction, we can see that food systems are a really big part of that climate puzzle. And in Canada, both, about 10% of GHG emissions are coming from agriculture, from crop and livestock production. But I want to get to three main points here. And the first one is that agriculture is a very unique sector. And it's unique because it's so intertwined with those natural systems, those biological systems. And so it's not only something that can contribute to climate change through, for example, production, processing, and transportation. It's also something that's very vulnerable and very impacted by climate change, where we see different climate events, extreme weather events that affect the food that we're growing, affect supply chains, and so it kind of has this double-edged sword there. Emissions also can vary. It really depends on what we're growing, where we're growing it, how we're growing it. And given that agriculture is so tied to the environment and we're fundamentally altering the environment to produce food, at the end of the day, there's always going to be some kind of emissions. But agriculture does have that one superpower that it can store or sequester carbon in either soil or plants. And that's something that very few other sectors can really say. Secondly, agriculture is also part of broader food systems, so it doesn't stand alone. And if we go to the first graphic,
I have to ask Muriel to move those along because I don't have the clicker. Sorry. Yes, here we go.
Okay. Oops, that's the second graphic. I think there's one that's a lot this one, yes. So this is the simplest graphic that we have of food systems, and it really just shows all these different elements of the food system. And you'll see that production or agriculture is just one of the many elements, and all of these kind of intersect and connect and have relationships with each other. If we go to the second graphic, the one that was just on the screen, perfect. We can see that this gets a little bit more complex. So we start to have dimensions like environmental dimensions, social dimensions, health, political, economic. And this is where we start asking questions around climate change, around food security, around governance. And these aren't dimensions that we can really ignore. They really make up how we live and function in society. And then the last graphic, it's the most complex one. And this
I'm
is
glad you didn't start with that one.
I thought that might be a little scary at the beginning. This one depicts a global food system. And you can see that not only does it have the elements of the food system, not only does it have those different dimensions, but it's also showing the different scales at which things happen. So it's not just the local food system, the regional, national, it's the global food system. So we have that additional layer of complexity where we're dealing with things like geopolitics, international trade, international standards that really form that whole story around the complexity of food systems. So I hope from these graphics you can see that it's not enough to just focus on agriculture on that production level. We really have to take into account all of those other complexities. And every link in this whole web matters for the kinds of climate solutions that we're talking about, the kinds of climate solutions that we want to make a difference. And the last point is that, we know that agriculture, food, and climate are interlinked, they're interwoven, but we also have to look at them from a holistic perspective. They have a holistic relationship. And, our climate solutions, they can't live in silos. And we have to look at how some of those solutions might impact different parts of the food system. And if we're using a food system approach to look at this, we might think, well, how does that affect the social, the economic, if we're implementing an environmental-only policy? And to give you an example, there are some practices on farms that they may mitigate climate change, they might decrease GHG emissions, but then they might also negatively impact biodiversity. So we don't want to solve one problem and then start causing 5 other problems in the food system. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I know you might be getting a little, afraid of all the complexities, but the really interesting thing is that in this complexity, there are pockets where all these different, or some of these different issues can converge. And this is what we call in systems thinking nexuses. And within these nexuses, we can act, perform one action or a policy that might actually not just mitigate climate change. It might help us adapt to it, it might improve biodiversity, it might improve livelihoods and food security. And that's kind of the beautiful thing about these nexuses. And something that's particularly important right now when we're having households, organizations, companies, governments feeling a very restrictive fiscal environment where we can tackle multiple things with one action. And the last thing about this holistic relationship is that regionality and context is super important. So different countries have very unique combinations of social, economic, environmental dimensions. And those are, of course, embedded in their own political and historical contexts. And even in a single country like Canada, if we're just looking at the ecosystem level, if we're thinking about implementing a particular climate solution, say in the prairies, that might work well there, it might work well for farmers there. But if we try and take that and then transplant it to Atlantic Canada, to Northern Ontario, that's not the same case. That might not make sense, might not have the same effect. And so we really need to think about where we're making these policies. And so ultimately, there is no silver bullet.
Yes. But what I think it makes it so interesting is that there are places where one action can have multiple benefits. And ultimately, all of this complexity has to come down to the local level.
Yes.
Which I think is part of what can make food systems so interesting a challenge to work in.
Yes, and approachable.
Yeah. So Brenda, if I can flip back to the big screen, you were living in Toronto and you were working in finance when you made a huge life change. You bought a farm and you began farming sheep for food and for wool. Can you tell us a bit about Black Sheep Farm and how you view the connection between food and farming and climate?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for having me here, despite not being able to drive in. I'm just sharing a couple slides here. This is a picture of my farm. I'm about 2 hours straight north of where you guys are right now. And we are, yes, a sheep farm. I've also been a vegetable farmer in the past. And the types of practices that we use are agroecological and regenerative in nature. And essentially that just means that we prioritize soil health, animal welfare, biodiversity, and social justice. So just an idea of what we do. Part of what makes this regenerative is that we move our flock of sheep on an almost daily basis, every 1 to 3 days during the growing season. And what this does is it keeps pasture plants as vegetative as possible. And what that does is it draws down more carbon through photosynthesis. Both perennial pasture plants and silvopasture tree systems, they sink carbon. So I was already mentioned by Margaret that that's one of the superpowers of agriculture. Essentially, that carbon is drawn down and it produces carbohydrates, which feed soil life. So it really does mean that we can grow meat, we can grow fiber, we can have them produced from forages that we can't eat as human beings. So, many of our farming practices do emit and sink carbon and greenhouse gases. But the way that farming happens can actually help mitigate and make us more resilient to the effects of climate change. And so where I work right now is with Farmers for Climate Solutions, and we're a national nonpartisan farmer and rancher-led coalition. And what we really want to do is advance policy, national, provincial, and municipal and field programming, which support farmers in the face of climate change. And so this is where we come to some of these nexi, I don't know what the plural of nexus is, that Margaret had mentioned.
Yeah.
And these are three beneficial management practices that work on farms across Canada in different ways. So the first one I want to just bring your attention to is managing nitrogen. Now, nitrogen is an extremely leaky element, so nitrogen fertilizers can get lost quite easily long before the crops that they're applied to can use them. So nitrogen in excess of plant needs is often applied to make up for this loss. But there are many different techniques that are available that can decrease this nitrogen loss. So actually, we can be more efficient with our fertilizer use and not have to apply quite as much. Because it is being used more efficiently.
And for people who may not be in farming, like managing nitrogen is really important because it's a really super strong greenhouse gas. It doesn't hang around for as long, but it does way more damage at the
Yes.
start, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It is one of our stronger greenhouse gases. It's probably, well, between that and methane from cattle, for example, it's probably one of our, the two main producers of greenhouse gases that affect climate change. So one of the other things that we teach to improve our nitrogen management is to actually calculate the amount that you want to apply based on maximum profitability rather than maximum yield. Now, this is not something I expect everyone to get. Let's just say that there are many different ways to improve our nitrogen use efficiency. And some are harder than others, and different techniques need to be used on different crops in different parts of this country, but there are tools everywhere in Canada that can be used. The next one I want to mention is rotational grazing. So that's the one that I am most familiar with. As I mentioned already, when you do some advanced rotational grazing, you can actually keep your plants more vegetative, which means that there's more photosynthesis that happens. And the other really important thing about this is that you're always keeping plant roots in the ground, and you're also having livestock on the land, which has an impact on the land, which actually improves soil health. So perennial grasslands themselves.
So Brenda, can you tell us what that looks like though? Like, so with the rotational grazing, can you just kind of just paint for people who haven't been near a farm in years what that looks like in practice?
Well, I'm actually going to just go back to that aerial picture right here. Notice how green this entire farm is. We pretty much have nothing plowed up for bare soil. There's plants. There are living roots in the ground at all times. Here I am with my sheep. We've got some netting at the back. They keep moving, so they're not on to a point where they overgraze and then start depleting plant reserves. We keep them moving so the plant always stays really healthy. And so if you go back to here, how it would look is you'd have little plots. So like where they are, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the next picture is when they were in here. Well, the next day they might be in here, and that just sort of, they keep moving around the farm. And so they're not on any one site for like the whole summer. Does that sort of paint a little bit of a picture?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So there's the grazing side, and here we have some cattle in this picture. And then finally, the last one that I want to bring up, and of course, there are ways to graze all across Canada. A lot of that has to do with how quickly your plants grow back. So in Ontario, we can actually keep bringing our animals back to pastures, maybe within one season. In really dry areas of the prairies, maybe the animals are only in one paddock once in the entire growing season, or even maybe only once in every 2 or 3 years. Then we come to cover cropping, and cover cropping keeps plant roots in the ground as well. Essentially, the idea is we don't want any bare ground. But cover cropping has lots of other farming benefits. They can help with erosion control, they can help with water management, and they can improve biodiversity because having a more diverse plant life also contributes to a more diverse insect and bird life. And those are kind of like the easier ones to count to then say that, you know, there's even more biodiversity going on. So I'm going to stop my share here. Oops. All right. But that's some of the things that make it hard to do these three things, because, the devil is in the details, right? A lot of the times for farmers, what can be hard is that they don't have the time or the resources like equipment or money to be able to implement these changes. The other thing that can be hard is troubleshooting. As Margaret was saying, you can't just take one thing happening, here in Ontario and do the exact same thing in Alberta. There's nuance in all of these techniques that need to be, done specifically for that area, that soil type, those crops. And for a lot of the benefits from these beneficial management practices, there's a longer timeline for benefits. It's not like you do that for one growing season and all of a sudden everything's better. It's really, something 3 to 5 years out. So that's a time and money and an equipment cost that farmers have to bear for a longer term. But overall, the whole purpose of these things is that you end up with more low emissions farming and higher resilience to all of the crazy weather, like the extremes of drought and flooding that we might be getting. Your soil is actually more resilient to that in the longer term.
That's awesome. Thank you. And speaking of soil, Ibrahim, you started off in the hard sciences as a soil scientist, but your work has moved over time to incorporate sustainable agriculture and food, which is now a focus of your work. So on climate change, the science is pretty clear. On farms, as Brenda was just pointing out, reality is pretty messy. So can you tell us about that friction and what it means for farmers?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Tenille, and thanks to the Arrell Food Institute for organizing this. Actually, I got to meet the folks at Arrell Food Institute while I was at the University of Guelph working on the core sciences, and since then it's been an amazing journey. So I think the best way to talk about this friction is that the science basically gives us very clear signals. So when it comes to climate, it's either we're looking at the rising temperature, or we're looking at rising sea levels, or we're looking at the changes in atmospheric composition. These signals are very clear. But when it comes to the farm, the signals are unpredictable because farming happens in a world where those signals, they show up in different ways. And at the farm level, that gives rise to two different approaches when we're talking about climate change. So there's the adaptation, which is dealing with those unpredictable issues, either it's weather variability or changing in terms of like the time when you can plant or where you can harvest. So you have to adapt your practices to that, deal with the issues of climate. And there's also mitigation, which is you find ways where you can reduce emission where those opportunities present themselves. But when it comes to grain farming or any field crop production, we find that adaptation isn't just a concept or an engineering problem where we can optimize. It's basically how farming happens because the whole environment is unpredictable. So the adaptation is always there. And there are other issues as well that lays on top of the adaptation. So we have market pressures that's also there. We have like the pest and disease issues. And then we have government regulations as well. All these play into the environmental, the unpredictability of the environment. So all this goes into the adaptation. So regardless of whatever the signals we have from the science is saying, the adaptation would have to happen because that's the only way you can actually produce food on the field. But mitigation is also essential. But mitigation is something that only layers on that adaptation because what's primary is the food production. And it's produced in an adaptive way. And on top of that, we layer a mitigation strategy where there's an opportunity to do that. So that's where the friction lies, where the science is telling you these are the signals, but the reality is telling you that there are a lot of unpredictability which you have to deal with, and it's something you cannot push away because if you push them away in the end, there's nothing to harvest, and then you jeopardize the whole food production enterprise. And I think one of the things which we try to do at the Grain Farmers of Ontario is to find a way to bridge that gap. And on the science side, we work with partners in academia as well as within government to try to refine some of those science. Either it's a science around the emission factor, or it's a science of how the carbon impact or the climate impact of our crops are performing, to better align those science to the regional context or to the adaptive cycle of a farm. So that's one of the things which we do on the science part. And then on the practical part as well, we advocate for policies and programs that basically support fair risk sharing among parties, because there's always risk involved. Those programs that are stable and can continue for a very long time, and also those programs that tend to acknowledge the adaptive nature of farming, which is integral to the existence of that operation. So this is some of the things which we try to do. The adaptation and the mitigation are two things which we think they can go hand in hand, but it has to be in a way where we protect the enterprise by starting with an adaptive nature of the enterprise, which is the practical aspect, and then layering any other clear signal which might inform us on where we want to go.
Yeah, because when it comes down to it, we need farms. And we all need farms, and we need to be able to eat.
Absolutely.
So putting that element first, it makes sense, got to say. But when we're talking about localizing solutions as well, like something that works in Kenya is not going to work probably in New Zealand. So that's localizing is not just a Canadian thing, it's a global thing as well, trying to find, so you're working with global policies, but local implementation, and there can be a lot of challenges in how they mesh together. Which brings me back to you, Margaret. You work in the global context at AAFC. Can you talk a bit about the growing links between food and climate? Because believe it or not, this is not the first time it's been discussed. And just tell us what that means for both sides of the equation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, believe it or not, the link between agriculture and climate at the international level is actually fairly new. It's been, I think, in 2017, 2018, we've officially started seeing agriculture come into climate negotiation talks. COP30, which is the Conference of Parties from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, just ended last week in Brazil. And what we've heard and what we've seen is that there are so many panels now that talk about food systems and climate change. Food systems and agriculture was part of the Balck action agenda that came out of COP30. And so we're seeing that more and more. But what's interesting is that not only are we seeing agriculture on the international, in the international space, but we're starting to see food systems too. And in 2021, there was a UN Food System Summit that was a very historical event that brought together a lot of people to talk about food systems for the first time. Out of that, there was a hub that was created that has been an evolving space that's talking about food system transformation internationally, and also kind of infusing that idea across all the different UN events. And so with that, we're starting to see agriculture and food systems not just as something that has to adapt to climate change, but it's a driver of innovative solutions. And what it means for governments and other countries, we all have to learn how to better integrate these policies together. And so Canada and other countries are trying to bridge these different negotiation spaces between climate and trade, agriculture, and food systems now, in order to better coordinate our policies and take a more systems approach to this. Mm-hmm. And it might seem like it's a simple and obvious thing to do if these things intersect, but in practice, it's actually quite difficult because of those ingrained and entrenched institutional structures, processes, and culture that we have. So it's really exciting to see that we're finally getting to the point where food systems is officially acknowledged as intertwining with climate. And
it's actually, so you mentioned COP and the UN. So the COP that we all hear about, it's actually one of 3 COPs. So back in 1992, 3 agreements were reached. There's the climate change COP, a biodiversity COP, and a land use or desertification, like land turning into deserts COP. And it's only in the last year that the UN has basically pulled these together. There's a really beautiful website if you wanted to go look at the UN conventions, I think it is, unconventions.org. But they've said between these 3 COPs, which were all built to do separate things, over time, the links between them have become clearer and clearer. And in the past year, they've said the 4 key things that connect them are energy, food systems, land use, and gender equality. So the fact that the room that we're in is definitively talking about 2 of those things, food systems and land use, and touching on energy because farmers are bringing photovoltaics in, and also touching on gender equality because that's a huge aspect of, a really representative food system. It's happening. It's been a long time coming, I think. So Ibrahim, you might be like some other people who are watching online or who are in the audience who've kind of found their way into food and agriculture-related work. I'm curious if you can tell us what's some of the biggest lessons that you have learned as your own work kind of expanded into this sustainability space?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and a complex one too, but I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. I didn't realize how much luxury I had while I was working on the hard science, while I was working in the lab. The luxury of not contending with uncertainties. So which is like what you do most times when you're in the lab. You can control everything, you can design the experiment and have results, and you just want to know the statistical difference between your results to know if they're valid or not. But that doesn't work in the real world. So for me, that's one of the things which I learned was in the field, a lot of things are uncertain. And the science isn't the most challenging part. So the science is often clear, but there are other things, either it's social, either it's economic, which controls how the science works. And all those things you have to contend with, because most times you're not even dealing with the science, you're just dealing with people's perception of a topic or of a solution. So the transition for me has been broadening that frame, bringing in other important factors that actually control the uptake of a solution. So the major lessons I learned was how to broaden that perspective and bring in other factors that would make a solution, which is well designed, not work.
Okay. I think that do you have any questions for each other? I know we've got like a minute left, but I thought I would find out.
I don't know if is Brenda still with us?
I think so.
I'm still here.
Okay, so Brenda, you also did a switch from finance into food. Like, what were your big lessons as you kind of transitioned from one to the other?
That I much prefer the food side than the finance side, and that it's a beautiful life that is full of uncertainty and experimentation. It's like doing a science experiment every single year, or multiple science experiments every year, but it's challenging and very fulfilling. And it's on the front lines of climate change. That's actually the reason why I got into farming, is that I thought that, considering how much I love to eat food, I needed to be participating in how it's produced.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us here and in Chesley. Thank you for making the effort. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. And for those in the audience, you can continue the conversation afterwards with our speakers at the reception that'll be just outside in the foyer. Now I would like to welcome AFI Director Evan Fraser to the stage, along with Dave Skene from the Urban Indigenous Garden Collective Wisahkotewinowak for a fireside chat. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Tenille. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all. And we got some claps. Thank you for the claps. Dave, come on up and sit down. My name is Evan Fraser, and I get to direct Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph. We're very excited that you're here, and Tenille, especially to you, thank you for pulling off this great event. My great privilege and pleasure, though, to have a chat with Dave Skene. A fireside chat with Dave Skene. So a couple of buddies moseying up to the bar, don't have the pint in front of us, but whatever. Dave, you work for an organization called Wisahkotewinowak. starts in 2016.
Yep.
You were just telling me about it, and it focuses on land-based education and urban gardening, for lack of a more sophisticated way. So just to start us off, paint a picture of the organization and your own journey that brings you to this point.
Yeah, just a little background. Wisahkotewinowak, hard word. To say it's a Cree word given to the Métis people. I'm Métis. Family roots are in Lesser Slave Lake area in Alberta, but I've been in Ontario for all my life. And Wisahkotewinowak means after a fire has gone through the land, the first green shoots that come up, that's Wisahkotewinowak. So the Cree gave us that in the sense of like a new people, but it also has the whole idea of newness and new life.
Yeah, that's great. So paint us a picture of what Wisahkotewinowak's activities are like if we visited you on one of your farms in the region.
Yeah, so we're urban. Our focus is, or the question we were really asking is back in 2016, as Indigenous people who are now very urbanized and find our home in the city, how are we still tied to the land? How are we still in relationship to the land? And also with the food that we're which we consider sacred, and so how our relationship with food. And so that was our question, and we're working with youth. So most of our work is still with youth. We grow food on about 3 acres of land. Some of it is at University of Waterloo, some of it is down in Kitchener at Steckley Farm. And then, so we're involved in that. The rest of the time when we're not growing food, we're doing urban land-based education for Indigenous, but also like we just finished a program with University of Waterloo and other organizations where we're doing land-based education. And then we're also involved in restoring 200-acre property out in Pioneer Tower area, where we're working on creating a food forest.
Yeah, so I mean, if we walked onto that piece of land, say at the University of Waterloo, in the middle of summer, not right now, because I imagine it's pretty quiet right now.
Yeah,
what would I see, or what would I be able to taste?
Yeah, we do mixed cropping in the sense of we do traditional foods. So we're doing Haudenosaunee white corn, which is probably our biggest thing that we grow. There's a large demand for that traditional corn, but we do traditional beans and squash. But we also grow whatever the community asks for, so tomatoes, peppers, all that kind of stuff. And then usually it's a small group of youth that are working in each one of our farms. And a couple of us, there's four of us on full-time staff.
So Dave, you mentioned just now corn, beans, and squash as the first sort of crops. You said that's not an accident.
No.
I mean, those are the 3 sisters.
Yeah,
so,
3 sisters.
I mean, maybe for the sake of filling them in people's brains, if they don't know what the 3 sisters are, what are the 3 sisters? And then let's build out the link between this conversation about your programming and the purpose of tonight, which is all about climate change.
Climate change. Yeah, 3 sisters, beans, corn, and squash. That they've been growing all over the Americas together. And basically there's a symbiotic relationship between the 3 foods that, or 3 plants that actually support each other in their growth. But in growing them together, it also builds the nutrition within the group. So when they're grown in a mound together, the nutrition within the bean, squash, and corn increases, I believe, by 11%.
So human nutrition.
Yeah.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And also just to maybe link this back to something that Tenille said about nitrogen, and nitrogen being a big greenhouse gas that causes a lot of the climate change events that we're experiencing. The legumes, the beans that you're growing, fix their own nitrogen, so reduce the need for potentially polluting inputs.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the main things of growing beans with the other two is for the nutrient infusion into the soil, and adds to the proteins that make it.
So, I mean, one of the things that I struggle with, because I'm a Western trained scientist, and one of the reasons I'm really excited to be talking to you right now, is when I was taught sort of the science of climate change, it was a very technical exercise about greenhouse gases emissions going up, that causes radiative forcing, which traps heat, which causes blah, 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 bad weather, etc. And it's taught as a very technical exercise, with inputs and outputs and mathematical equations. But your secret sauce, for lack of a better way of putting it, is building relationships with people and the land through the programming you're doing.
Yeah.
So maybe you can build a bridge for us a little bit about why a relational approach to these issues might be as important as well as the sort of more technical, sort of scientific, quote unquote, approach that I was taught.
Yeah. I think, like, from an Indigenous, well, I don't want to speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but from a Métis perspective, and some of the things I've learned from elders and teaching along the way is what we see often is in Western concepts. The easiest way we could define that is that the way the West does things is kind of like untethered from the land. So, and then tethered to, an economic system that's based on consumption, and so needs to continue to consume. And so land-based, or that relation idea, kind of moves us into being re-tethered to the land. And it's not just Indigenous people who are tethered to the land, but anybody can be tethered to the land. But it's moving away from that into a relationship. And in relationship, you've probably heard it said that, we save the things we love, or and so if we're working towards environmental issues or food issues, and food security and food sovereignty, then it's really the things that we love that we're going to work really hard to save. And so the relational aspect we see as significant. And also the last part of that too is like the land is our first teacher. So how do we relearn, how do we rethink through some of this stuff? Is I think the land is the first place we go to learn.
All right, awesome. At dinner, we were bonded over a somewhat shared experience, and I spent a lot of years as a Beaver Cub Scout venture leader teaching kids all sorts of sort of land-based skills, and you did something similar this afternoon, which made me warmed my heart. So maybe describe to the audience what you did this afternoon, and then why it's relevant to tonight's conversation.
Yeah, we just wrapped up we are teaching a course at University of Waterloo in not environmental, but I can't even remember what department I was working in.
Doesn't matter.
But anyway, we just finished teaching a course. It was a land-based course. We had about 46 students. Just did kind of like introduction, like how to build a fire, all that kind of stuff. But all that kind of simple connection with the students, again, leads them back to this, like a more intimate connection with the land. And I think like that, that in itself creates a sense of belonging. So when the students were giving their feedback this afternoon at the end of the class, they all mentioned a sense of belonging to the land and a little bit more to the community. And when we belong somewhere, we hope we wouldn't mess that up. So I think that is a good environmental thing, that we kind of begin to see ourselves as belonging to place.
All right, Dave. We get overwhelmed by these global issues, and I'm so grateful that you came and brought us to a place and a moment of optimism. And I see we've got 3 seconds left on the clock, so I guess I'm going to say thank you.
Yeah.
David Skene, everybody.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
Good. So folks, I get to stay up here, and I'm going to invite the next panel up on stage. So Amber, Richard, Mary, do you want to come on up? I'm going to ruffle through my notes. And as my colleagues are coming up, please just, I'm going to sit here. I guess we want you in that seat, Richard. Mary, if you want to sit on the end, and Amber, you come sit next to me, if that's okay. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'd like to invite you to sort of picture three things. They're experiences I've had quite recently, and the first is an Indigenous entrepreneur who won Female Entrepreneur of the Year award a couple of years ago by, I think it was the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, but I might have that detail wrong, for a company that she started up, which is attempting to build or is building very fancy greenhouses, specifically pitched at Indigenous communities in the north, both to give them a climate resilient way of having local produce, but also a way of reducing the climate change emissions of their diets. So that's picture one, or innovation number one. Innovation two, I had chatted with a new Canadian, someone who's recently come to our country, just a couple of weeks ago on a CDL session that Mary knows about, a Creative Destruction Labs session. And he has a quote, nanotechnology spray that goes on the outsides of greenhouses and means that the light passing through the greenhouse is more useful to the plants that grow underneath. And as a result of that, greenhouses that use LED lights can turn their lights down, reducing energy costs. And the plants that grow underneath, because they're getting what is called photosynthetically useful wavelengths, grow better. So that's innovation number two, which I got to do. And then innovation number three, again, another startup that my colleague Mary knows, essentially brews dairy protein and egg protein in a facility literally that you could brew beer in. And so these are dairy and egg proteins produced without cows or chickens at all. And the reason I'm just sort of sharing those three things is in the course of my day job as Arrell Food Institute Director, I get to talk to people with ideas like that. And they fill me with tremendous optimism that we can use food as that big lever on climate change, as Tenille said. And so that sort of innovation about can we apply the best ideas out there to this great big issue of feeding the future in a way that doesn't compromise the ecosystems on which we and our children and our grandchildren, et cetera, all depend for life. It gives me a tremendous amount of optimism. So with that, I'm going to say I'm so excited to talk to the group of you tonight. Amber, you're the co-founder of BioNorth Solutions, I beg your pardon, an Indigenous female-owned soil remediation company based in Northern Ontario. So really excited to hear about what crazy innovations you're working on to boost production while reducing emissions. Richard, Clean Economy Fund Advisor, part of the University of Waterloo's Global Futures. You were led the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which goes back to those early days of the UN process in the early 90s. I think IISD was a part of Canada's commitment to that 1992 Rio Summit.
When sustainability was a brand new word.
When sustainability was a brand new word. So very excited to meet you tonight. And Mary, you're the general partner at a venture capital fund called Nàdarra. And you and I have known each other for a number of years through the incubator program, Creative Destruction Labs. So great to have you. Amber, maybe I'll just give you the opening word to talk a little bit about your startup and how you're contributing to this broad area of climate change and food.
Yes, so my company is called BioNorth Solutions. We're based in Thunder Bay, Ontario, so north shore of Lake Superior, smack dab in the middle of nowhere.
You've come a long way. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. So what we do, we got our start in soil remediation. So using microbes, bacteria, to clean up oil spills. So just really improving soil health in a natural way that's been around for millennia. And then as we were continuing with that, we thought, well, we should try to grow back plants onto the soil that's been reclaimed. And then from there, we entered into the world of biologics in agriculture. And probably the most common biologic is which lots of people know from greenhouse stores. It's mycorrhizal fungi. It helps to fix nitrogen, and it's just a fungus that grows naturally. And that's really what we do. So we harvest natural bacteria from soil, from root systems, and then we determine how they can work to improve plant growth in the case of agriculture. And yeah, so we help to assimilate nitrogen, also looking at phosphate, and really just helping plants have bigger roots and helping them to grow better while making the soil healthier.
So a quick follow-up for you. I mean, you're based in Thunder Bay, which I don't necessarily associate with big tracts of wheat growing areas or big agricultural potential. I mean, is it a little weird for you to be working on agriculture from a position in the North Shore of Lake Superior?
It's very strange.
Okay. I'm not getting that wrong.
No, I'll admit it. We definitely are not an agricultural hub by any means. But you know what? The great thing is that we have a really tight community. So we do have farmers, you know, be it on a smaller scale. Definitely, they don't have tens of thousands of hectares. But we have wheat farmers and canola farmers, sometimes just for forage. And then we also have more specialty crops like strawberries. And being the smaller, tighter community that we are, it's quite easy to work with them. And to be honest, I live in Thunder Bay. It's 10 minutes from one spot to another, no matter where you're going. So it's very nice to be able to go somewhere and look at our crops and look at our trials and go back and head off to the next spot, but then also to work with these trials throughout Canada and the States. And we're actually doing some in Colombia too, which is pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, I'll bring you back into the conversation in a sec, but I'm going to bring Richard in right now. And so as head of IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, what's the big view, or the view from the very top of the parapet for you? What are the big global challenges and opportunities do you think facing this big area of sustainable ag?
Well, thanks, Evan, and thanks to all the panelists. I actually think that the comments so far have captured the situation quite well. I mean, the challenge is, you know, it's interesting thinking about this panel. I stepped back and looked at some of the latest UN reports, the FAO reports, and the list of challenges. You know, and they're lengthy. I don't need to remind folks about the challenges in funding and technical capacity, infrastructure for storage, transport, a whole lot of things that challenges that we have to face. But I kind of share your optimism. If I were to kind of pick one thing in terms of an opportunity or a class of opportunities, I think for us, it's in a class of something called, often referred to as nature-based solutions. And we actually spoke around this, I would argue, today already. Margaret, you talked about, you know, finding that nexus, right, where issues converge, where you can find things that are positive for nature and for farmers and for the environment. Dave, I loved your idea about becoming retethered to the land. When I talk about nature-based solutions, I'm just talking about ways that we can work with nature rather than against it. And there's actually a great example here just across the street. How many of you love Waterloo Park, right? It's just across the street and enjoy it. And we have, one of the things I love moving to Waterloo region since 2019 is these great green spaces and these stormwater retention ponds we have. They're fabulous, right? And they're not just beautiful and wonderful, and that's important too. But you know, these are what I would call nature-based solutions. They're a way of managing stormwater. You know, rather than pouring concrete or having that water wash down a street or asphalt and concrete and down a sewer, you know, we're retaining it in those ponds in a way that those kind of solutions can restore groundwater. They can create habitat for waterfowl, so they can support biodiversity. They can support carbon sequestration through the growth they support. And if you do those kind of solutions right, if you look for that nexus that we talked about, that Margaret spoke about, you know, there's actually ways to achieve these kind of solutions that they can be the sort of triple bottom line winner. They can actually be positive for farmers. They can be positive economically. They can be cheaper than pouring concrete if you do them right. Not always, but they can actually be cheaper. and better for everyone. And it's those kind of solutions we have to push for.
Okay, can you make this a little more real for us? I mean, when you said nature-based solutions, what's the sort of the first practical or tangible thing that comes to mind? And maybe just sort of paint us a picture of what that would look like on the ground in a context or something.
Well, that's why I mentioned the stormwater retention ponds, because the example for me, so, because Waterloo Park is right there. And the reason I thought of that and why it struck me when I moved here is one of the best examples when I was running IISD was actually a project we did in Manitoba called Pelly's Lake. You can look this up, P-L-L-Y. And Pelly's Lake, it was an area in Manitoba where the farmers were suffering because of flooding. And again, the idea here, you could pour concrete to kind of resolve all that and manage that. But by creating what was called a managed wetland, right? Essentially diverting the water, creating a wetland area where the water could be diverted away and stored, you actually created a solution that was not just cheaper than that concrete, but you had better carbon sequestration. You managed the spring runoff in a way that you managed those flood conditions, but you also mitigated some of the drought that often comes later in the summer. And the farmers, we have a video of this if you want to Google it, the farmers actually call this a huge win. So when you can achieve something like that that's positive for climate and positive for nature, and the producers are thrilled with it, I think that's the gold standard, and that's what we have to kind of push ourselves to.
So last question to you before I shift to Mary. If it's so obvious, why aren't we seeing a whole lot more of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because it's not, when you take Pelly's Lake, you can take that case study, but you can't sort of carbon copy that, right? It comes back to, we were talking about local situations. Often these solutions have to be customized, right? So there's a number of challenges. A major one, and this gets a little bit technical, but an important point here is there's a lot of talk globally around natural capital accounting. And what I mean by that is simply, how do you properly value all of those services that a wetlands provides us? If you pave paradise, as Joni Mitchell said, you can take that parking lot and put it on the balance sheet, right? But how do you put the wetland on a balance sheet and value all those ecosystem services? And so you can make a good decision, right? A good decision about actually valuing the benefits that we get. And I think that's one of the challenges. But again, there are challenges here, but let's remember what the opportunity is that if you work hard to try to find those benefits and structure the projects in the right way, it can be done.
Yeah, nice. Mary, as noted in my opening remarks about you, we have worked together as mentors, advisors for the Incubator Creative Destruction Labs. For me, I feel a little guilty whenever I show it because I take a lot more away than I give at the CDL events. From your perspective as a seasoned investor in ag tech startups, what's most overlooked in your opinion when we talk about the food systems and these transformations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the food value chain in general is a lot larger than what people think. I think Margaret's image was a very good demonstration of that. So at Nàdarra, we're a $30 million early stage investment fund. We're focused on early stage investments, which are companies that are essentially getting their first pilots with customers and then moving on to multiple customer demonstrations with large corporates to really demonstrate their technologies. And so in our case, I mean, we're investing all the way across the value chain, and that could be from seed to feed to fork and any kind of waste stream in between. So it's really more of a circular economy than we'd think. And that could be a plant pesticide, and especially on the biopesticide side, all the way to a food as medicine play or food as performance. Like some of our recent investments have been in Health Canada approved nutritional supplements, meal supplements like Sperry, all the way to a company called NAC, which is really the first-in-class sport nutrition company for marathon runners and ultra runners with an exclusive partnership with UTMB. But then we also invest in companies like those that are creating milk without cows. And so they've isolated mammary cells within udders. They've been able to use those mammary cells, expand them, and actually create milk. And that milk will be present in all dairy products. So I think just in general, the ecosystem is a lot larger and a lot more creative than we think, and Canada's doing a really good job in it.
All right, I love that. But let's hang on with you, and I'm going to ask the same question. Start with you, Mary, and I'm going to work my way back along the thing. What's holding us back? I mean, we often, and you and I have had this conversation, that Canada should own the podium in agricultural innovation with an emphasis on sustainability, broadly defined. But yet, I mean, I do a lot of work with the Royal Bank. The evidence suggests we are falling behind. Entrepreneurs like Amber, I'm sure there's a million things that are standing in your way of scaling. So, I mean, come back down the line. What's holding us back as a country in this amazing sector?
Okay, so I guess to set the stage, amazingly, ag and food investments are increasing 6% year over year. That's phenomenal in terms of a global market. Canada is only 3% of that investments, and we're actually down 20% year over year. So,
so just pause there. This is the most amazing sector of the economy, in my opinion. This is a country poised for greatness, in my opinion. This is a sector that can solve major global problems, in my opinion, yet Canada is falling down on this one. So I just want to double click on that. Back to you.
It really is remarkable to think about because there's about a $2 billion funding gap in Canadian companies alone. So it's not that the innovation isn't existing here. It's just that the funding mechanisms are not here right now. And there's a couple problems that go into that. So Canada has a really remarkable system in terms of non-dilutive funding. The companies that you see here will get multiple grants, and some of those...
Just explain non-dilutive. That's a bit of a financial phrase.
Okay, so dilutive funding is us investing, like investors investing in you. It means a percentage of your company is taken away. Non-dilutive funding is grants. So those are something you never need to pay back. It's the merit that you've had for either an academic project or an industry project or things like that. The government actually has programs, as well as academia has programs, that really enable researchers to work with companies or researchers embedded in companies to do these projects in, let's say, a 2 to 3 year range. So the non-dilutive funding parameter, because it's so great here, companies will kind of stay in the process of actually staying in these non-dilutive spirals a little longer than they should. And most of my career actually was in the US, and I came back to Canada around 2.5 years ago and really saw exactly why that was happening. And there's a bit of a stopgate in that case, where companies, instead of feeling the pressure to grow and work with venture capitalists or private investors or Silicon Valley, they feel comfortable in kind of their incubators, in industry, in academia, et cetera, and will keep going for these grants over and over again. Unfortunately, that means that they're not scaling at the rate that they need to in terms of large-scale fermentation or large-scale connections across international borders, and that actually puts us behind.
All right, so we've heard from the investor as to what's holding us back. Richard, maybe take a policy lens or a global governance lens. What's holding Canada back in this area?
Yeah, I mean, something we really have to contend with. Like, let's face up to the issue here that there are some pretty tough compromises we need to break, and one of the chief ones is economic. So some of the work I do in energy is with around green hydrogen, for example. And I think when I put my IISD hat on and I think about the transition, I think, well, it's inevitable that ultimately things like fertilizer, which is responsible for 1% of global emissions right now, the production of fertilizer, that ultimately that's going to have to involve green hydrogen. We're going to have to remove those emissions. The fact remains that that's really expensive today, and it's just not going to happen, right? And so we have to contend with those real economics. We have to meet producers and consumers where they are. We have to recognize that the cost concerns are real. When I talk to some of the senior food people in IISD, the way they've put it quite bluntly, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, is, they've said that, we can't move abruptly today to full organic production because, we'd lower yields and unintentionally drive further deforestation. I mean, that's sort of the blunt reality, right? So how do you kind of manage this transition in a way? You've got to, you both have to have the idealism and the vision and the dream. You talked about the opportunities, and I spoke passionately about nature-based solutions. But you've got to find a way to bridge that gap, and you're going to have to do the really hard work to make the economics work, and to do the work with producers to really make this stuff happen.
All right, so Amber, Mary and Richard have talked at a sort of a high abstract level. What's holding you back and your colleagues, the entrepreneurs, in trying to do the good work, bring the new products, bring the alternative solutions to society?
Yeah, something like our products, it's very interesting, especially in agriculture, because you have two different dynamic living things working together. So the bacteria are living, as are the crops. And this has been stated many times, it's not that because something necessarily works in Saskatchewan, does it work in Ontario, or because it works with wheat, does it necessarily work with corn? And that's something that is really something that you have to prove out the data for as a company, and not only prove to customers, but also prove to yourself so that you know where your market is. And that takes time over time. It's replicate trials and such. Another thing as an entrepreneur is policy is difficult. Sorry, Margaret. But for example, with our plant growth products, they have to be registered through the CFIA. It was a really lengthy process, and in one case, up to 4 years. So that's something after you've put your time into developing that product, then you're going into a policy program where it's quite delayed. And I've heard from large companies as well that they will actually not bring products to Canada just because of the length of time for different CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, regulatory approvals. So that's one thing. And then you taught me something, and it's very true. Grants have held me back as well.
So interesting.
Yeah,
Grants have held you back.
They helped us to grow.
As a grantrepreneur, that's a difficult thing for me to swallow.
Yeah, but you know what? It's really true, and it really resonated with me because it's something where I'm a woman-owned business, and we're a green business, so we are very grant-worthy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a very easy trap to fall into. And the longer that we've been in business, it's been just over 11 years now, and I've realized, no, I don't necessarily want to own 100% of that. You know, I'd rather own a smaller percentage and have something that, because business is not for the weak of heart. It's you definitely have ups and downs and broke times. And it's something where having people that can support you and help you grow, be it if they have strength in regulatory or if they have strength in finance, whatever the case may be. There's so many nuances, and thank you for teaching me that. Just kind of, it really resonated the way you said it.
VCs love grants too. If we know an entrepreneur is looking to raise $10 million, like obviously if that entrepreneur is coming to the market, then candidly, if let's say a percentage of that can be covered by non-dilutive grants, then that's absolutely ideal for both the percentage of the company that'll be distributed, because one of the things that, you know, as a venture capitalist, you're really financing the founder. You're financing the entrepreneur to take that forward. We're not coming in for a controlling interest of the company. We're not managing your business. We want to make sure that you're incentivized to keep going. So grants are great that way, because if it can cut that chunk and you can keep going, the thing that makes them more difficult is a grant has 10 lines of exactly what you have to do. And you as a business, you need to pivot sometimes.
Exactly.
And so if you're on the schedule of a grant, then you can't pivot the way your business needs to pivot. You have to fulfill the needs of that grant, which could hold you back. But
Especially when you come into times like COVID, right?
absolutely.
Let's stick with you just for a second more, Amber. One of the stories I often hear in talking to innovators is that in order to take the sort of real first commercial steps, they have to go to the States. And that is something I hear so often, and I can give you example after example after example. A vertical farming company I used to mentor, they didn't have enough revenue to be legitimately able to be built on industrial land because they didn't have the cash flow. They wasn't quite agricultural enough to be built on agricultural land. They have a viable business in Washington State now, not British Columbia.
Okay.
So, I mean, have you ever felt the siren call of south of the border, or your colleagues? And what do you say to the issue that to be successful as an entrepreneur in this space, you really have to move south?
I think there's definitely something to that. I mean, there is not only the population base, but just different factors, and some of them being, in my case, the regulatory factor. Sometimes there's also an openness to different technologies and different innovations that there may not be necessarily in Canada, especially being from a smaller, more community that is not surrounded by larger communities. When I come to Southern Ontario, you find a lot more openness than you do actually. And I love Thunder Bay, I'm not bashing it, but it's sometimes we're a little bit more stuck in our ways and doing things in a traditional methodology instead of being open to something new.
Good.
Can I jump in on this?
I'd
And then I'm
love you
curious
to.
to go to Mary because the companies I work with are not all entirely in the ag space, but kind of adjacent to it. And for me, it's all, for the work I do with them, it's all about the customers. It's all about the offtake and the agreement and finding the customers. And so some of that question about Canada, the US, if you're talking about a major fertilizer producer, right? It has to do with where they are. It doesn't matter the country so much. And then it's about setting up that right environment, government support, de-risking, trying to get that long-term agreement that you can then finance the company behind. Yep. And I turn to you because I suspect this comes up with your portfolio companies as well. So I'm curious how you see the Canada-US thing playing out, or is it really just about where are the customers and can you get those offtake agreements or those contracts signed to make the investments go?
No, I mean, it's a great question. What I would say is, as we all know, the last couple of years in the U.S. has changed quite a bit.
Really? How so? Really?
As someone who spends a third of my year still in the U.S., I felt it very much so at the beginning of this year. And the tariff requirements have changed trade astronomically in terms of the inputs that are now in our Canadian companies, in terms of essentially how we distribute the supply chain as well, right? So a very important thing about the investments we make and the protection of the companies is how distributed their supply chain is. It's actually a way to isolate their intellectual property. It's a way to protect all the ingredients in a way that sometimes if you don't have to patent something, and a patent will list exactly what's in the product, what's going on. You hear kind of trade secrets and the Coca-Cola model of nobody really knows what's in Coke, but it's a trade secret. Well, Coca-Cola, for example, has like 6 different factories that all send brown bag, which is essentially unlabeled ingredient packages, into their facility so that nobody actually knows in the distributed supply chain what goes into the secret sauce. And so if you think about like the companies that we have here now that are doing that in terms of their vitamin packages or whatever it is, let's use a food product as an example, because I think it's something that we pick up every day in a grocery store. In that case, now, let's say 20% of that product is now up 30%. And 10% of that product might be up 20%. And so that's kind of changed the way that we're doing large-scale procurement agreements. So in one way, it's changing who we're working with locally, but in other ways, it's now changed the importance of the Canada-US relationship into, is there an opportunity for Europe? Or is there an opportunity for Asia? And so I think a lot of the companies we're working with now, they've been a lot more flexible in who they're working with, the types of trade agreements, and now they're actually changing their product lines or their product offerings in order to meet some of those higher regulatory requirements. Because in the case of Europe, EFSA is their regulatory body. It's probably the most brutal. Like Health Canada and CFIA is tough. Mm-hmm. It's really tough. But EFSA is a whole other ballgame. So all the ingredients sourced based on that now, people have had to change their formulations, they've had to change their processes in order to now meet the needs of Europe, and Asia less so, but then you have to think about kind of the back end of that as well, which is everybody's been creating patents or trade secrets around the US Patent Office. And now they have to re-register in all these other patent offices. And that's tens of thousands of dollars every time you go into a new patent office. So there's been a huge backlash in terms of how we're looking at partnerships. And some of our companies are doing better in navigating that. Some of them had already ready set for what that relationship looked like with Europe, but others are struggling because they had such close relationships with the US, and at this time, we don't know what the next 24 months is going to look like for them.
Yeah, huge uncertainty. Richard, maybe I flip to you now, and you started in your previous comment to talk about lessons from other sectors. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity to sort of double down on that. And sometimes we think of food as exceptional or as different than other sectors of the economy, but you have a background mostly in clean energy, not in agri-food. So are there things that perhaps the energy transition or other parts of the economy can teach us about how to manage the relationship between food and climate change?
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the other speakers, the first panel touched on this, right? This idea of, again, Margaret, your nexus, or the idea that you have to find solutions that integrate, environmental concerns, but with economics and politics. So, for example, with electric vehicles, you've seen that, of course, policy had a role to play in terms of subsidies, but you also needed the technology to mature and the economics to get to a place where this was actually much more feasible for folks, right? So it isn't just a question of saying, this is the world we want, we're gonna just like write a law and make it happen.
Yeah.
And you're seeing some of that backlash or that pendulum swing on EVs, and I think it's amazing how far they've come. I think it's amazing where we're at versus where we were 10 years ago, so I'm an optimist on it. But again, the point is that if you want this to happen, it isn't just a case of, someone said there's no silver bullets. It isn't a case of just finding the right technical solution. You have to find a solution that works with the economics and politics as well, right? That really has to work. And actually, I just want to say something that I'm an advisor to the Clean Economy Fund, which funds some of this work in Canada as one of the charities. And they've made this point to me, actually, when I was preparing for this panel. They said that when it comes to farmers, they're finding that a lot of producers don't even want to use the word climate. They don't like to use the word climate, even though it's so intertwined with, climate is both impacting ag and ag is impacting climate, right? It's a huge connection. But that creates a real challenge for how we engage them. And again, it comes back to, we've got to meet people where they are. Right? We've got to find solutions that help people with the issues they face today. And again, to come back to the EV story, why have EVs come as far as they have? It's because, yeah, they're good for the environment, but guess what? From Waterloo to Toronto, I can drive round trip for $3 now. Like there's other benefits to them as well. And so we really have to work, in this case, directly with producers and find solutions for them. It's not enough to kind of come from the think tank and say, this is the right idea. It really, really has to work, and it has to work for startups, and it has to work for companies, it has to work for producers.
All right, Mary, over to you, and then back to Amber. Mary, Richard just said something about technologies need to mature. I mean, from your perspective as an investor in startups, are there some areas that are giving you specific or technology stacks or pathways that are giving you particular optimism that you think are worth leaning into? And other ones maybe that are perhaps, in your opinion, overhyped and are worth leaning back from?
It's a good question. I think I guess one of the things I'd say is I think the advancement across the value chain has been pretty consistent. I think bioproducts in general are probably where Canada, you're seeing a lot of effort in that area. So that's essentially the replacement of synthetic chemicals in any kind of, let's call it construction material, any kind of detergents. We actually have a company in our portfolio called Dispersa. They're based in Montreal. And what they've done is they've created something called a biosurfactant. And that is, surfactant is essentially what creates the foaming agency in all of your soaps or your detergents or things like that. And they've actually used anaerobic digestion. So they've used the waste streams of food oils and combined that with the waste streams of maple syrup to feed the bacteria, and they've created now this biosurfactant that's had to be replaced by essentially all of the corporates. And so I would say probably the major aspect of innovation we're seeing, and we do a lot of our thesis work around this, is right now regulations, and it's basically because of consumers like yourselves that are saying we demand cleaner products. That's really what's pushing innovation forward. And because and I came from the corporate venture side myself. And so what I will say is, and I'm not saying this about the companies I've worked for in the past, but what the change really occurs when you're told change needs to happen. And you have 2 to 3 years in order to make that change. And so the one you've probably seen everywhere right now is get rid of red 10, right? That ingredient that creates the red in Pop-Tarts and all the great things that we all love. Companies only have until 2027 to make that replacement, which is astronomical when you think about it, right? In all of their product lines, they have to do that now in 2 to 3 years. And so that is essentially what fuels this innovation forward, because it's too slow for us internally at a large corporate to actually do those processes together. So what ends up happening is essentially a tech acquisition play, where we'll go across, we'll find the 10 best companies across the world doing a color replacement, and we'll put those into our product pipelines. You're always developing your own solutions in-house, but you end up having this really nice share of intellectual property as you're putting that together. And that essentially is the fastest way to get a product to market. So I like what I'm seeing across the value chain, but I will say consumers are dictating, and it's a really powerful time for consumers to be able to do that.
Well, that's a powerful thing to end on. Amber, over to you. If you could wave a magic wand and change just something in the financial policy, regulatory, consumer environment that you and your colleagues are operating in that would allow you to be way more effective at doing what you're doing, what would you like to see done?
I think it is starting to change as well. So part of it is consumer, part of it is regulatory, different regulations surrounding climate change and environmental laws as themselves. So yeah, lots of that is really starting to happen. And then products like microbial products, they never had a distinct box before where they fit into a regulatory framework. And they really are starting to, which is, it's been tough as a business, but there also is a real advantage to it, because then you know that you are actually in compliance, and sometimes it gives you a competitive advantage too, being able to be in that compliance framework. So
wonderful.
Yeah, it is happening.
Thank you. Folks, I'm just going to quickly wrap things up as we wind the clock down, and then I will invite you to thank our guests. But for me, one of the things I've done as an academic over my career is look deep into history, not 1992, but maybe 1892 or 1592. And, sparing you the long lecture, one of the lessons of history is bad things happen to societies that fail to manage their food systems. We've got cases like the French Revolution that starts when droughts triggered crop failures, which triggered price rises, and the fact that we remember the French Revolution as Marie Antoinette's quote, "Well, if there's no bread, then let them eat cake," which she did not actually say, but the fact that we attribute that to her is the significant point. The point is that bad things happen when we fail to manage our food systems. But if you look at the lessons of history. The lessons of history are actually positive. There are far more decades of progress and prosperity than there are decades of crisis and collapse. Not underselling the tragedies of history, but saying that we can look at the historic record and see a lesson of innovation, a lesson of ingenuity, a lesson of finding common purpose and collective action that mostly lets most of us get along okay. Not always. We are going to test that hypothesis over the next generation. I am quite confident. And I am also going to end with a note of optimism that I believe that when the history books of the 21st century are written, there will be significant chapters on food and innovation, and that those chapters will have a lot of good news in them. It won't all be depressing and sad. So with that, I would just like to say an enormous thank you first to my colleagues. So I'd like you to welcome you to clap for my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then I would like to say a final thank you to Tenille and Muriel and the staff that made this night possible, the Arrell Family Foundation that funds the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph. And Alice, I think we can now move to drinks and a reception next door and have some mingling. So with that, thank you everybody for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.